We thought it would be another thrilling adventure for our YouTube channel, just like the countless places we'd explored before. Haunted houses, abandoned tunnels, eerie shrines, we had done it all. But Aokigahara, that was different. It had a reputation, one that even seasoned explorers avoided. They called it the Sea of Trees for how dense it was, how it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I'm Akira, and I ran this Japanese horror YouTube channel with my two best friends, Riku and Haruto. We grew up together, inseparable since grade school. What started as a hobby, chasing urban legends, had turned into a growing YouTube channel. People loved watching us dive headfirst into places most wouldn't dare visit. Aokigahara felt like the natural next step, the place that would put us on the map. We'd heard the stories, of course. People said the forest was cursed, that you could hear whispers that weren't your own or see figures that didn't belong to this world. They claimed it was easy to get lost, even for experienced hikers. Haruto laughed it off, saying they just don't know how to navigate. Riku agreed. He was always the skeptic. It's just another forest, he said. People love to exaggerate. I didn't say much. I wasn't sure I believed in curses, but something about Aokigahara unsettled me. The way people spoke about it wasn't the same as other haunted places. This wasn't playful ghost stories or urban myths. There was a weight to the way they warned us, as if they truly believed the forest could claim you. Still, we ignored the warnings. We packed our gear, marked out our route, and promised each other we'd stick together. Just another adventure, I told myself, but deep down, I knew this wasn't like the other places we'd explored. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to the warnings, because once we stepped into that forest, it became clear we weren't just visitors. Aokigahara had been waiting for us. We reached the edge of Aokigahara just after noon. The sunlight barely broke through the canopy of twisted branches, casting a dim greenish haze over everything. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you find in nature. This was heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It felt unnatural. Haruto pulled out his camera, already narrating for the video. We're here at Aokigahara, the infamous Sea of Trees. Let's see if the legends are true. He was trying to sound confident, but I could hear a slight edge to his voice. Riku was focused on the map, muttering about keeping track of our route. We decided to use bright orange tape to mark the trees as we went, just in case. Better safe than sorry, Riku had said. I didn't argue. As we walked deeper, the silence seemed to press harder against my ears. Every step we took on the soft forest floor felt muted. The trees grew closer together, their roots twisting like veins through the earth. It felt as though the forest was closing in around us, making the world beyond it disappear. Man, this place is creepy, Haruto finally admitted, breaking the silence. He was usually the loudest, always cracking jokes to lighten the mood. But here, his voice sounded out of place, almost intrusive. We found our first sign of something off, about 30 minutes in a tent. It was old, its fabric faded and torn, almost swallowed by the moss and undergrowth. Scattered around it were personal items, a rusted water bottle, a shoe, a notebook too weathered to read. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. Haruto crouched to examine it, his camera still rolling. Someone must have camped here and bailed, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Then, out of nowhere, a breeze swept past us. It was cold, biting, and completely at odds with the stillness of the forest. I froze. The trees hadn't moved, not even a single leaf. It's just the wind, Riku said quickly, but even he glanced over his shoulder. The thing was, it didn't feel like wind. It felt deliberate, like something brushing past us, letting us know it was there. We moved on, trying to shake it off. Haruto cracked a few weak jokes to break the tension, but no one laughed. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest felt. In the back of my mind, I started to wonder if the warnings were more than just stories. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees pressed closer together, their branches nodding above us like a cage. The silence had grown heavier, if that was even possible. It was the kind of quiet that made your ears strain, like they were desperate to catch a sound, any sound. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't something I could see or hear, but it was there, lurking just out of reach. I told myself it was just nerves. The stories about Aokigahara had planted ideas in my head, and now my imagination was running wild. Then we heard it. Soft, faint footsteps behind us. I stopped in my tracks, holding up a hand to signal the others. We all turned, peering into the thick wall of trees we'd just walked through. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the same eerie stillness. Probably an animal, Haruto said. But his voice had lost its usual bravado. Riku didn't say anything, he just kept glancing over his shoulder as we continued walking. A few minutes later, he cursed under his breath. "This doesn't make sense," he said, holding up his compass. The needle spun wildly, never settling on a direction. He pulled out his phone, but the GPS was dead. Great, no signal either. Haruto laughed, though it sounded forced. Typical horror movie stuff, right? Next thing you know, we'll find a creepy old doll or something. Nobody laughed. We kept going, trying to stick to the route we'd planned. It felt like the forest was playing tricks on us. Trees that should have looked familiar didn't, and every path seemed to lead deeper into the maze. Then Haruto spotted something ahead. A piece of rope tied to a tree. It was frayed and dirty, but it stretched in a straight line through the forest, disappearing into the shadows. Someone must have left it to mark their way, he said, following it. My stomach twisted. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. Maybe we shouldn't do this. Come on, Riku interrupted. If it leads to a trail, we might be able to get back on track. I wanted to argue, but Haruto was already ahead of us, following the rope. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I followed. The rope led to a clearing, the first open space we'd seen in hours. The trees seemed to bend away from it, their branches reaching like twisted fingers. And in the center of the clearing, something waited for us. I held my breath. The rope ended at a clearing, and in the middle of it stood a small makeshift shrine. It looked like it had been pieced together long ago, half swallowed by moss and time. Around it were scattered offerings, coins dulled by rust, food that had long since rotted, and faded photographs of people we didn't recognize. Some were smiling, others solemn, their faces barely visible through the grime and decay. Haruto was already filming, moving closer to the shrine. "This is incredible," he said, his voice too loud for the oppressive silence around us. It's like someone tried to appease something. It didn't want to get closer. Something about the shrine felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the world we knew. The air here was different, thicker, heavier. Even breathing felt like a struggle. "Haruto, let's just keep moving," I said, but he ignored me, focused on his camera. Riku, who had been quiet the whole time, suddenly froze. He was staring into the trees beyond the shrine, his face pale. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "See what?" Haruto asked, turning his camera toward where Riku was pointing. "There, in the trees." I followed Riku's gaze, but saw nothing, just the same. Tangled branches in suffocating darkness. Then it happened. A shadow shifted, not like an animal or a person, but in a way that made my stomach lurch. It didn't walk, it glided, unnaturally smooth, like it wasn't bound by the same rules we were. Haruto swung his flashlight toward it, the beam cutting through the gloom. There was nothing there. "Probably just our imaginations," Haruto said, but even he didn't sound convinced. None of us wanted to stay any longer. We decided to move on, leaving the shrine and its decayed offerings behind. But as we walked, something else became clear. Our tape markers were gone. Riku checked the trees where he'd tied them earlier, but there was nothing there. "They were here," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm sure of it." Haruto tried to joke, maybe the wind took them, but no one laughed. The forest didn't feel like it was just watching us anymore. It felt like it was shifting, trying to trap us. We kept walking, unsure of where we were going, but none of us said the word we were all thinking. Lost. The forest grew darker faster than any of us expected, the last bit of sunlight fading into an oppressive black. Our flashlights flickered on, their beams struggling to cut through the thick shadows. The quiet was no longer just silence. It was alive, pressing down on us like it wanted to smother every sound we made. And then the whispers started. At first it was so faint, I thought it was the wind rustling the trees. But there was no wind. The air was completely still. The sound wasn't coming from any one direction. It was everywhere, all at once, wrapping around us. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Riku and Haruto nodded, their faces pale in the dim light. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something deeply wrong about the voices. They weren't just around us, they were inside me, crawling into my ears, my mind. And then I heard it, clear as day. It was my name. I froze. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the other whispers like a knife. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. Then Haruto started walking. At first I thought he was just moving ahead, but he didn't have his flashlight on. He wasn't filming. He wasn't even looking back. He just walked, his movements stiff and unnatural, heading deeper into the trees. I yelled at Haruto, chasing after him. I grabbed his arm, yanking him back. He stopped, blinking like he'd just woken up. "What happened?" "You were just walking off," I said, my heart pounding. "What were you doing?" Haruto looked shaken. "I don't know. I thought I heard someone I knew. But that doesn't make any sense." We stood there in silence, the whispers still circling us. Riku was gripping his camera tightly, his knuckles white. "This is bad," I said. "We need to get out of here. Now." "No," Riku snapped, his voice sharp. "We've come this far, we can't just leave without getting something for the channel." "Are you serious?" I shot back, my voice rising. "This isn't some dumb abandoned house, Riku. This is different. You can feel it. Exactly why we need to stay," he said. "No one's ever captured anything real here. If we do, it'll blow up." I stared at him, my chest tight with frustration. Haruto was quiet, but the look on his face told me he was torn. Caught between agreeing with Riku and wanting to leave. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. My name came again, softer this time, but closer. Knew we should have left right then, but Riku had made up his mind, and the forest wasn't done with us yet. We stumbled upon it by accident, a rusted, weathered sign leaning crookedly against a tree. The writing was faded, but we could still make out the ominous message, "Do not proceed beyond this point." The air felt heavier here, like we'd crossed some invisible threshold. Haruto read the sign out loud, his voice cracking slightly. "This is it," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. "This is where we turn around." "Turn around and go where?" Riku shot back. "The tape's gone. We don't even know the way out anymore." The frustration in his voice was obvious, but there was something else too. Fear. Haruto shined his flashlight beyond the sign. The light barely reached the trees ahead, swallowed by the darkness that seemed thicker here, more alive. As we argued, the shadows began to move. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, our flashlight swaying slightly in our trembling hands. But the shapes stretched unnaturally, long and spindly, crawling across the ground and twisting up the trees. They moved as if they had a mind of their own, unaffected by our light, or the lack of it. "Did you see that?" Haruto whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't see anything," Riku said quickly, almost defensively. Then Riku froze. His scream tore through the suffocating silence, raw and panicked. He stumbled back, clutching his arm. "Something touched me," he shouted. "It grabbed me." Haruto swung his flashlight wildly, and I followed suit. The beams cut through the darkness, desperate to find whatever had terrified him. And then we saw it. For a second, the light caught it. A pale face, half hidden behind a tree, its skin sickly white, its eyes like two endless black pits. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. Its very presence was wrong, unnatural, and unbearable. Before any of us could react, the figure melted back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Haruto's voice shook as he whispered, "We have to go." For once, even Riku didn't argue. We turned back the way we thought we came, but every step felt like we were walking deeper into the forest. The shadows followed us, silent and watching. We moved quickly, barely thinking, just trying to get away from whatever we had seen. The forest around us seemed alive, shifting in ways that made no sense. We marked the trees, Riku said, his voice strained. "Why can't we find the tape?" I didn't answer. None of us could. Every direction looked the same. Endless rows of trees, their trunks twisted and gnarled like outstretched claws. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and damp leaves that muffled our footsteps. The whispers came back, louder this time. They didn't feel distant anymore. They were in my head, weaving through my thoughts like a poison. I stopped in my tracks. My name. It was clear as day, spoken in a voice I recognized but couldn't place. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Hear what?" Haruto asked, glancing over his shoulder. Before I could respond, something flickered in the distance. Small, glowing orbs floated just beyond the trees, pulsing faintly like they were alive. "What is that?" Riku asked, his breath hitching. "I don't know," I said, "but maybe they'll lead us out." It was a desperate thought, and I regretted saying it as soon as the words left my mouth. But what choice did we have? Standing still felt worse than moving forward. Without another word, we followed the lights, stepping carefully through the underbrush. The orbs danced ahead of us, always just out of reach, like they were toying with us. Minutes felt like hours. Every step weighed heavier than the last, the whispers growing louder with each passing second. My legs ached, and my chest felt tight, but I kept going. Then the orbs stopped. They hovered for a moment, then blinked out one by one, leaving us in near total darkness. When we shined our flashlights ahead, my stomach dropped. It was the same abandoned shrine we had found earlier, surrounded by the same decayed offerings and overgrown roots. The rope we'd followed the first time was gone, as if it had never existed. Haruto sank to his knees, staring blankly at the shrine. His hands trembled as he muttered under his breath, "We're trapped. We're never getting out of here." I didn't know what to say. The reality of it was sinking in. We weren't just lost. The forest was playing with us, pulling us deeper into its grasp. And it wasn't done yet. The whispers stopped. Just like that. They were gone, leaving behind an unsettling, suffocating silence. My ears straining for any sound. For a second, I thought maybe it was over, that whatever was tormenting us had finally left, but then I heard it. It was faint at first, like something tapping lightly on the trees. The sound came from somewhere deep in the forest, rhythmic and deliberate, growing louder with each beat. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Neither Riku nor Haruto responded. They didn't need to. I could see it in their faces. They heard it too. The knocking moved closer, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out my thoughts. That's when I saw it. The figure. It was no longer a fleeting shadow or a trick of the light. It was real, stepping out from behind the trees, its pale face illuminated by our flashlights. The hollow black pits where its eyes should have been locked onto us, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. It started walking toward us, slow, deliberate steps. The sound of twigs snapping beneath its feet was deafening in the silence. Riku screamed at us, "Run!" His voice cut through the terror like a jolt of electricity. I didn't need to be told twice. We took off, crashing through the underbrush, the forest blurring around us in the beam of our flashlights. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop. Then, behind me I heard it. Heavy breathing. It wasn't mine or Riku's or Haruto's. It was something else. Something unnatural. It was right there, so close I could feel its icy breath on the back of my neck. I wanted to look back to see how close it was, but my body refused. Some primal instinct told me that if I turned around, I wouldn't make it out. The rhythmic knocking returned, blending with the sound of our frantic footsteps. It seemed to come from every direction, as if the forest itself was alive, herding us deeper into its clutches. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as the battery struggled to keep up. Panic clawed at my chest. "Not now," I muttered under my breath. Ahead of me, Riku stumbled but managed to catch himself. Haruto grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. The knocking grew louder, faster, more erratic, and the breathing. It was right there. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running in circles, trapped in some twisted nightmare with no end. But stopping wasn't an option, not if we wanted to survive. I didn't know how much longer we could keep running. My legs were jelly, my chest felt like it would explode, and every breath was a struggle. But then, out of nowhere, we burst into a clearing, and there it was, the edge of the forest. I could see the faint glow of the moon shining on the open ground beyond the tree line. Freedom. Safety. It was right there. "We're almost out," Rika yelled, his voice hoarse. For a moment, hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. We sprinted toward the boundary like our lives depended on it, because they did. But just as we were about to cross, I heard a muffled cry behind me. It was Haruto. I whipped around and saw him being pulled backward, his feet sliding in the dirt. He clawed at the ground, his eyes wide with terror. He screams for help. Without thinking, Riku and I grabbed him, digging our heels into the earth as we pulled with everything we had. It felt like tugging against an anchor. Some unseen force was yanking Haruto deeper into the forest. Then I saw them. Shadowy hands, dozens of them, reaching out from the darkness. They stretched unnaturally long, fingers curling around Haruto's legs and arms. The sight made my stomach turn. They weren't just pulling him, they were claiming him. Haruto was screaming now, his face pale and streaked with dirt. I tightened my grip on his arm while Riku grabbed his other one. Together, we pulled as hard as we could. My muscles burned, my hands ached, but I refused to let go. The hands seemed to grow stronger, dragging Haruto closer to the tree line. The air around us grew colder and the whispers started again, louder and more insistent. Then, with one final desperate yank, we pulled Haruto free. The three of us tumbled backward, collapsing onto the ground outside the forest boundary. Haruto was shaking, tears streaming down his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back at the forest. The shadowy hands were gone, but the darkness between the trees seemed deeper, almost alive, as if it were watching us. We didn't say a word. We didn't need to. We had made it out, but barely. We sat there on the cold ground just outside the forest edge, too drained and terrified to say a word. The only sound was our heavy breathing and the distant rustling of leaves. Haruto cradled his arm, wincing. "What was that?" he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at his arm and felt my stomach churn. It was covered in long, angry red scratches, deep enough to draw blood, but not enough to bleed heavily. They looked like claw marks. "Did those things do that to you?" Riku asked, his voice shaking. Haruto didn't answer. He just stared at the forest, his face pale and eyes unfocused, like he was still trapped in whatever nightmare we'd just escaped. Riku stood abruptly, pulling out his camera. "We need to delete everything," he said firmly. "No," I replied, startled. "We need to upload this footage." "No, it's not worth it," he cut me off. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the footage. The screen flickered, the images glitching unnaturally. He didn't hesitate, deleting every single file. Haruto nodded slowly. "No one should ever see this. No one should ever go there." I stayed quiet, staring at the dark line of trees in front of us. It felt like the forest was still watching us, still waiting. Eventually we got up and walked back to the car. None of us said a word the entire way. Even now, I can't forget that night. I still dream about Aokigahara, about those hands, those whispers, and that figure with the empty eyes. And sometimes, late at night, when everything's quiet, I swear I hear the whispers again. Even when you leave that forest, I don't think it ever really lets you go.